Okay, I'm not sure where to start, so I'm just going to jump right in. You're probably wondering who this Geekman guy is. Well, like a lot of you in the retro computing community, I work in IT. I've been using Macs for a very, very long time. I'm also a little bit of a graphics designer. You might know me from the Bad Caps t-shirts that I've made and a bunch of others that are much less popular. So for a long time, I've been lurking around the community, watching the videos that some of you have made, commenting occasionally, making t-shirts. Eventually, I got the itch to do some restoring of my own. My first project was the wood grain Mac Mini, which was from Macintosh of 2023. It was a fun art project, but I already owned the hardware, it was in good condition, so it was really more of a refresh. And there are plenty of people who would say that a 20-year-old computer doesn't yet count as retro, though that seems arbitrary and subjective to me. So in spring of 2023, I started to think about a new project. But what would it be? Which Mac? What era? One of the great things about this hobby is that you can pick up hardware that you lusted after 20 years ago that was completely impractical for you to own at the time. It was reserved for professionals, but now it's available to you, it's accessible. And that's the case with the PowerMac Macintosh G3 blue and white. I mean, this thing is just so iconic, beautiful and tacky at the same time. And I knew that this had to be my next project. Unfortunately, I wasn't super familiar with the Tinker Different forums like I am now, so I resorted to eBay. Pickings for this Mac were pretty slim at the time. I didn't want something being shipped a long ways or maybe having to pay tariffs, so I chose something that was in Canada, and I was only able to get the case at first. Now, this was not in great condition. One of the handles was not original, and I paid $155 after shipping. Yeah, I think I kind of got hosed a little bit. But that's okay, right? I can go find the motherboard now. Oh. What's worse is that these motherboards were often sold without processors and as is, i.e. not in working condition. So I started to realize I would have to think a bit creatively about this. And I noticed that G4 motherboards were actually substantially cheaper. Now, this might have been pure coincidence, but I have a feeling that there's a historical reason for this, and it's really interesting to dig into, so let's do that. See, back in the day, some Mac enthusiasts noticed that Apple was not being super careful with managing service providers and their inventory of repair parts. So there were a lot of spare CPUs and motherboards just floating around, and then people noticed that they could put these inside of ATX cases and use ATX power supplies and use standard ATA hard drives and CD drives. In fact, I did something very similar for my workplace back in the day where I stuffed the guts of a G4 into a ATX rack mount case so we could have an extra OS X server on the cheap in our rack instead of having to buy more X servers. There was a whole site dedicated to this practice that you could find on archive.org, and it includes this image that I have to show you of a Pentium 4 heatsink and fan zap strapped to the G4 processor. I mean, you can't make this jank up. Now, eventually, Apple realized that their parts supply chain was out of control and was competing with their actual sales, so they got their lawyers out and put the kibosh on that, understandably, though still disappointingly. But let's get back to the project at hand. Now the wheels were turning for me. What if I took my PowerMac Macintosh G3 case that I love the look of so much, slapped a G4 motherboard in there, made some other improvements, aesthetic and functional, and came up with something potentially cool and unique? Now, naturally, we have to have a rage bait warning for the purists out there. This is not going to be a faithful restoration. I'm going to avoid permanently modifying anything, but I am going to modify things to make them fit my concept. So if that's the kind of thing that really bothers you and is going to prompt you to type a mean comment, you should probably quit now because this is not the video for you. That said, there are a lot of advantages to using these G4 motherboards. They were clearly cheaper and easier to obtain. They have more power because they're a G4. It's a board that I'm familiar with for the purpose of my restoration. It's very compatible in that it can use an ATX PSU, it has USB, PCI, an ATA IDE bus, and it fits in the blue and white case. It can still dual boot OS 9 and Mac OS X, and it doesn't have that many electrolytic caps. So I won't have to try my hand doing a ton of recapping. Now, before we go on any further, I want to call out Mac OS Photo Booth, which I thought would be a convenient capture tool for my external camera on a stand, but as it turns out, Photo Booth likes to randomly corrupt videos, and it has been doing this for years. And I lost several minutes of footage from the start of this process to photo booth. So thanks for that, photo booth. But don't worry, you'll start seeing some actual video in this video pretty soon. Now, obviously, the first thing you want to do with a new motherboard is replace this awful battery before it leaks. Next step was to do a bench test, which I did using this adapter cable. The power supply pinout is very, very similar to an ATX one with just a couple of modifications, so you just have to swap those pins around and it works perfectly, including the power on. I used a SATA solid-state drive with this classic SATA to PATA adapter from StarTech. Things worked really well under OS 9, but as soon as I installed my Mac OS 10 partition, I got a lot of crashing. And this is fortunately something I was familiar with from my previous G4 experience. With these early G4s, you have to make sure that you're using the Apple firmware update 4.2.8 F1. The main feature of this is, quote, drastically improved stability under Mac OS 10. So you definitely want to install that if it hasn't been installed already. You can see the boot ROM version in System Profiler, as I've shown here. So with a successful test of my logic board out of the way, I disassembled the case. This was important because I wanted to clean all of these parts. They were filthy. Have I mentioned how much I hate snaps? It's because they snap. Speaking of highly fragile 25-year-old plastic, another component that I needed to look at was this. It's called the compliant mechanism. One quirk of the G3 and G4 cases is that they use this bendy plastic frame to secure and unlock the case before you can open up the side. Now, this thing was in rough shape. There was a piece broken off the corner, the tabs that held it in place were snapped, and everywhere there was a screw hole, the plastic was starting to crack. Now, fortunately, Andrew from Apple Product Collection was kind enough to send me this G4 version of the compliant mechanism, which is in wonderful condition, as you can see, way better, and actually allows me to close the case. Now, while everything is mostly compatible between the G3 and the G4, there are a couple of spots here where there are standoffs that interfere with the G4 motherboard. So they were fairly easy to remove, but now I've got some holes that I don't want to be seen from the outside of the case when the plastic is reinstalled. So I've just covered those with some aluminum tape to make sure that when the case is back together that they're not obvious from the outside. Well, we've arrived at the part you're going to hate. To do what I want to do, I'm going to need to take off these G3 decals, and they're really thick polystyrene or some kind of plastic, so I am going to preserve them, and someone will be able to put them back on in the future if they so deem. Now, unfortunately, they did leave behind a lot of sticky residue, but some cleanup with WD-40, some elbow grease, and eventually some polish got rid of most of that. There is a tiny outline of the original decal, but that'll actually be helpful to align something new. So I matched the font and the color, and I had these G4 vinyl decals made up. They're not exactly the same in terms of the material. This is not something that ever existed. The graphite G4s did not have this G4 text under the plastic. The blue and white G3 was the only one to have that. But I think you'll agree it looks pretty good. So now that I'm done rubbing cleaner on the outside, I think it's safe to install some internals. I have one IDE optical drive, and that's this LG DVD drive, which suits me just fine. I found an ATX power supply that would fit inside the G4 case. The original 120mm case fan was in pretty rough shape, so I decided to just replace it. I also hacked up this custom cable to allow me to tap into 12 volts from the CPU auxiliary power connector. Next, I decided that I wanted to max out the RAM, which was easy to do because Otherworld Computing still sells the RAM for this Macintosh, along with many other vintage Macintoshes, which is kinda crazy. Well, there's no shortage of video now, so how about some nice assembly montage music? For now, I have this Rage Pro PCI graphics card. I've also got a vintage Linksys wireless card, which works with both macOS 10 and classic macOS. Here's that ATX power supply adapter I mentioned, as well as the StarTech IDE to SATA adapter. Now, as I mentioned, Apple Product Collection was kind enough to send me these Quicksilver G4 handles, but the look isn't quite right. They're clear acrylic and we want them to be frosted. So I thought to myself, how would they look sandblasted? Luckily for me, I had 5 of the G4 handles total. So I had a friend of mine media blast one of them as a test, and it looks just perfect. Now, as I'm building from parts, I need some peripherals, and we need to talk about the genuine ones. I don't think this is a controversial opinion, but these have to be some of the worst things that Apple has ever designed. That puck. I owned an original Bondi Blue iMac, and let me tell you, this thing was years of suffering which way is up. So I got myself some Mac Ally, whatever, peripherals. These are period specific, and I chose them because they were what I replaced the iMac peripherals with when I finally got sick of them. As expected, these were absolutely disgusting. I cleaned the whole thing, and there's a video of me reassembling the keyboard somewhere, but, well, only Photo Booth knows where that video is now, eh? You can see the spacebar is still pretty shiny, but overall I'm satisfied with the end result. Wow, look at that, suddenly it's back together. I spent a lot of time agonizing about what mouse to buy. I ended up going with this matching Mac Ally iMouse Pro. During the blue and white plastics era, optical mice were still making their debut, so although I wanted an optical mouse, I needed to settle for a traditional ball mouse. One of the screws is badly rusted, but as luck would have it, I have an identical replacement in my parts bin. Another reason for the iMouse Pro. I also didn't want to deal with a single button. I feel as soon as the contextual menu entered the scene in macOS 8, 2-button mice really should have been immediately mandatory. In my humble opinion, Apple keeping the single-button mouse as long as they did was one of those classic bouts of Steve Jobs stubbornness that was not warranted. Though I guess I can't blame Steve entirely since he was at Next most of the time. Looking good. Well, nothing to do now but put those incredibly delicate plastics back together. Time for another montage, but maybe this time with some music I wrote in GarageBand back in the days of the G4. While I was putting the case back together, I noticed the G4 screws have a brushed metal finish, while the original G3 screws use a stonewash finish. I really prefer the look of the brushed screws, but I didn't have quite enough. So I used my drill with some sandpaper and some WD-40 to change the finish. This is what I wanted. Yikes. I may not be as much of a whiz at electronics as some of you, but I know a dead speaker when I hear one. I managed to get a speaker on Amazon that fit the dimensions, so I ordered it and swapped the connector. Ah, much better. Now undoubtedly you've already figured out a major flaw with my case swapping plan, which is that the back panel I/O ports aren't in the same locations. I tried to get the original component, but it really is part of the metal case. So 3D printing to the rescue. I printed out these metallic stickers as well. They're not a perfect match for the originals, which have a neat lenticular effect, but they'll do. I didn't want to risk misaligning the holes for the ports, so I decided to just cut them out later using a little patience and a very sharp X-Acto knife. There we go. In order to attach my 3D printed I/O cover to the case, I needed to remove the motherboard, so I need to do one final reassembly of the internals. The back looks pretty good. If I had to do it again, I might try a translucent plastic, but at this point I'm ready to be done. And the white edges are a minor quibble. I had a bit of a well duh moment when I realized machine screws weren't going to work in plastic. Fortunately, finding some tapping screws in my parts box was pretty easy. You may have also noticed that I swapped out the PCI Rage Pro for an AGP Radeon 7000. The GUI in Mac OS X was pretty laggy, so I decided I needed a little bit more GPU oomph. Alright, let's give it one more test. This time I want to use the power button on the external keyboard. And here it is, a blue and white PowerMac G4 with 2 gigs of RAM and an SSD capable of booting both classic Mac OS and Mac OS X. Despite my best efforts, there are still some scuffs and scratches and minor cracks, but as we used to say back when I painted wargaming miniatures, if it looks good from 3 feet away, it looks really good. I want to shout out a big thank you to Apple Product Collection, not only for donating the spare parts, but also for these gorgeous photos of a meticulously restored stock blue and white G3. Thanks also to Jess B's tech department on YouTube, whose video of her own G3 restoration made tearing down that brittle plastic exterior, full of snaps, much less stressful. This project and video took me 3 years, in part because the last 2 years have been the busiest of my life work-wise. I don't know if you'll see another one of these from me anytime soon, but I wanted to prove to myself that I could do this, make a video, that I wasn't just the bad caps t-shirt guy. So, I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like if you did. Thanks for watching.